far better than this. So let's go back to our other chart as I sum up here, Mr. President. Senator Pryor, Senator Begich, and a group of senators, I believe, including Senator Shaheen, Senator Hagan, Senator Landrieu. I believe they're all on this proposal, as am I. With their sacrifice, military retirees paid in full. They paid in full. And to offer amendments that have nothing to do with the subject matter, but open up an entire battle on immigrant families who are working so hard because there are some examples of fraud, just as there are examples of fraud in corporate America. Unfortunately, there's examples of fraud all across America, including in politics, okay? But I have to say, to go after the most vulnerable children and the most vulnerable families and try to convince this United States Senate that that's something fair, I just think it's off the mark. And I hope we will reject the Ayotte Amendment. I hope everyone will read what Sister Simone said, that the proposal to go after children is misguided. It is antithetical to the gospel's call to care for children and those at the margins of society. It violates our long-held values as a nation, and it should be rejected. And I want to remind everyone, if anyone commits fraud in this society, I will be the first one on the floor saying, go after them. And we already have a law that is very, very clear. Anyone who commits fraud in connection with the child credit, refundable credit, shall be guilty of a felony and upon conviction shall be fined not more than $100,000, $500,000 in the case of a corporation, or imprisoned not more than 3 years. If my friend on the other side of the aisle believes that justice isn't doing enough, the Justice Department or the IRS isn't doing enough to go after this fraud, I got to say, let's call the folks in charge. Let's tell them that we want to make sure that there is an effort. Write a letter. But don't say, because a few people are doing a bad thing and should go to jail for it, don't take your paintbrush there and paint every immigrant family who have dreamers with this. This is outrageous to do, and especially to claim that you're not doing anything to hurt the children and you're doing it to help the veterans. The veterans have paid in full. Let's vote for the veterans, okay, for the veterans and for the children. You vote for the veterans by voting for Pryor. You vote for the children by voting no on the mean-spirited Ayotte Amendment. Thank you very much, and I yield the floor. And I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Could you stay here? Cement.
Senator from California.
I'd ask that the quorum call be vitiated
Objection.
and that the nominations be reported.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session and consider the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nominations: Department of State, Richard Stengel of New York to be Undersecretary, Sarah Sewell of Massachusetts to be an Undersecretary, Charles Hammerman Rivkin of the District of Columbia to be an Assistant Secretary, Department of Veterans Affairs, Sloan D. Gibson of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary.
Under the previous order, there will be 30 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be equally divided on each side of the time.
Objection.
And I would now note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to talk about 3 highly qualified nominees for very significant posts at the Department of State. And the Foreign Relations Committee, which I'm privileged to chair, has moved 48 nominees to the committee just this year alone. I'm pleased these 3 will move, but I want to express my concern about the remaining nominees. They are critical to us promoting our foreign policy and our national interests and security interests abroad. So I urge my colleagues to support movement of these nominees to the floor as quickly as possible. The 3 today are Richard Stengel, who has more than 30 years of experience as an author and journalist. He brings, I think, a very unique perspective to his role as the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, which we'll be voting on. He's served as the managing editor of Time magazine during the past 7 years, demonstrating his impressive managerial capabilities. And he led as the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, where he brought public education efforts to raise awareness about our nation's founding charter and the values enshrined in it. And this public diplomacy role is incredibly important in a world which is constantly getting closer and smaller by virtue of the mass media, the internet, and all of the different forms of communication. And our advocacy in public diplomacy is incredibly important to get our message out as the United States in terms of our bilateral and multilateral pursuits. Dr. Sarah Sewall has been nominated to serve as Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, and she comes to this position with significant relevant experience. She's taught at the Naval War College, served as a director of Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. She's highly regarded as an expert on mass atrocity prevention and response. She's now a senior lecturer in the public policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Her large portfolio will include a range of issues, including challenges to civilian security in Latin America, Syria's growing refugee problem, which is a concern for us in terms of the entire region, a good ally, Jordan, for example, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, human trafficking and women's issues. These are all incredibly important in the pursuit of our foreign policy, and I'm confident Dr. Sewall will be an excellent Undersecretary, and I urge my colleagues to support her nomination. Finally, we have Ambassador Charles Rifkin's deep experience in the private sector and a clear talent for managing large organizations, which I believe position him well to take on the position of Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. And at a time when our country is pursuing the most ambitious trade agenda in generations, and our companies and workers are facing tougher and more aggressive competition than ever before, Ambassador Rifkin has demonstrated the skill and the experience needed to lead the State Department's participation in formulating and implementing international economic policies aimed at protecting and advancing U.S. economic, political, and security interests, particularly at a time in which we are seeking to create greater jobs here at home. Our advocacy abroad to open markets, to have transparency, to have the rule of law for our companies who do invest abroad, to ultimately ensure that when they make such decisions, that if there's a violation of their contracts, they have a transparent judicial process that they can go and litigate their issues in, are incredibly important to not only our companies' investments abroad, but the jobs created here at home that promote the products and services that we generate across the globe. So I urge my colleagues to support these nominations in pursuit of the national interest and security of the United States, Mr. President. And with that, I yield the floor and observe the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from New Jersey.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask consent to yield back all time on both sides, including the 2 minutes prior to the vote.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Yeas and nays are ordered. Under the previous order, the question occurs under the single nomination. Yeas and nays have been ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Beckich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi,
Couldn't shut the water system down, so we're adjusting this chemical. And the reason we did it was because of public safety.
Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Walsh, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Beckich, Blumenthal, Cardin, Isaacson, Joannes, Manchin, Menendez, and Warren. Mr. McCain voted in the negative. Mr. Vitter, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye.
First one has it.
Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Ms. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mrs. Sheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Rono. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Why she Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Ms. Heitkamp? Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Bozeman? Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Walsh? Mr. Walsh, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Risch?
Can you call the roll?
Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? No. Any senator wishing to vote or to change a vote? If not, the ayes are 90, the nays are 8, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form prior to a vote on the Sewell nomination. Is there objection? Without objection, time is yielded back. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The yeas and nays are ordered. The question occurs on the Sewell nomination. Yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. McCain. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Sure. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi.
No, next window. Stand, Marion.
Gotcha. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Right here.
I got you. Yes, sir. Got
One page. Is this my copy?
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken.
Lisa and Roger, before you give me a final note.
I'm not, I always try and say yes.
Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
So much better than Frank.
Mrs. Hagan.
You're much higher, Bart.
Mr. Harkin.
You're always doing good. Well, like we got can't do that.
Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich.
You don't have to do it.
Ms. Heitkamp.
He's showing off what he's going to the White House.
Mr. Heller. Mr. Graham.
When he accuses the president.
Ms. Hirono.
Actually, I got to make a speech. Are you going home?
No, actually, my dad stepped
Sure. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar.
I really think it ought to apply to everybody prospectively. I think what you guys
Ms. Landrieu.
one statewide before.
Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee.
Under Section 3B.
Did you see what
I got you. I got him.
I'll talk to you. All these guys, they don't want to.
Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin.
Is there any way?
Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada,
You don't think I would tell you no? Oh, I know.
Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Walsh, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Gotcha. Second.
President. Aye.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Boxer, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coates, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Heinrich, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Paul, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Walsh, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Shelby voted in the negative. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Not yet. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Wishing to change the vote?
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 97, the nays are 1. The nomination is confirmed.
Move to reconsider.
Mr. Leader?
We need to do that. No. Madam President.
Mr. Leader?
We have order.
Order? Order?